Hi, I'm Matthew Kane, and this is the Dirty Air F1 Podcast.
1 light, 2 lights, 3 lights, 4 lights, 5 lights, and it's go, 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 go!
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Dirty Air F1 Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Kane. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this episode, I'll be reviewing the Bahrain Grand Prix, both qualifying and race results. We're going to talk track limits and how 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton went out and simply won this race. But first, a quick reminder, if you'd like to connect with me on social media, I am dirty_F1 on Twitter, and I'm the Dirty Air F1 Podcast on Instagram. I also launched my YouTube channel this week. How about that? I never cease to amaze myself. You can find it by searching the show's name on YouTube, simply the Dirty Air F1 Podcast. I have 3 episodes currently up on YouTube right now. I have to be careful with YouTube because if I have any music in my podcast at all, and I don't have any permission or license to use it, YouTube will not hesitate to pull that down. So you'll notice that you might find some of my intros on some other platforms, but you will not find that on YouTube. It's simply going to be my spoken podcast. And a quick shout out to all of those on Twitter who followed me this week. I've gone from 26 followers, I think about 2 weeks ago, to almost 300 now. And this is all very new to me, but I'm enjoying the interaction with people from all around the world. And hey, let's keep this momentum going. And speaking of momentum, boy, Nakita Mazepin, he's got a lot of momentum. It's just going in the wrong direction. I thought Nakita did quite well in preseason testing, but boy, he didn't have a good weekend this weekend, did he? He ended up getting called into the weigh station at a very critical time, which cost him dearly. And on his outlap, when everybody was queuing up for their final qualifying session, he was told by the team that if he didn't go, he wasn't going to even get his lap in. He ended up listening to the team and taking the directive and passing everybody so that he'd make sure that he'd get his lap in. This violated what's called the gentleman's code. Essentially, the code is you're not to pass any other driver that's queuing up for their final hot lap. All the drivers have been spacing themselves out so they can both benefit from a potential tow down a long straightaway, but also still remain far enough away that they don't suffer the dirty air in the high-speed corners. Mazepin then promptly made quick work of his hot lap spinning in turn 1 after suffering a brake-by-wire failure. Unfortunately, it was just a combination of a team that panicked, a rookie driver who didn't know about the code, and a technical issue. Unfortunately for Nakita, things didn't get much better in the race. He made it through 2.5 corners before he got on the curb and got on the power and got into the wall. I think that has to be the biggest fear for Haas this year is they have 2 ambitious young drivers who have something to prove, and they're driving vehicles that simply can't do what they want to do. So overdriving them is going to cause incidents just like we saw with Mazepin out in turn 3 or turn 2. Thankfully, he wasn't hurt. But fair to say Mazepin needs to improve. Mick Schumacher had a completely different weekend. He had a pretty decent qualifying session, out-qualifying Mazepin by close to 0.8. Started the race, had a bit of a wobble early on. But you know what? You could definitely tell that people around the paddock are putting their arms around this young man and embracing him and helping along the way. Decent result for Schumacher, finishing 16th in his first Grand Prix. He said and did all the right things. You know what? 2 thumbs up to Mick. Way to go. Way to go, kid. No surprise to see Haas at the back of the field. That's where they're going to be for the remainder of the year. Focus is obviously on developing these 2 young drivers and putting as much mileage on the car as they can. So tick that box for Mick Schumacher. Not so much for Nakita. Next up, qualifying in 18th is... It's both a shock, it's a disappointment, but it's also sort of what my gut was telling me the whole time. 4-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel. I mean, when is this guy's luck going to turn? Or is this just a clear indication that Seb's days are done, or at least numbered? Let's face it, he didn't get enough time in the Aston Martin to begin with to even get used to it. and was the victim of yellow flags in turn one when Mazepin had his brake failure right before Seb's hot lap. But did Seb really show any pace? Did that car show any pace? I mean, that car looked difficult to drive. One thing I was surprised about was that all those guys who had unfortunate qualifying sessions at the very back didn't go onto hard tires to start the race. They all went on the mediums. You take into account that it's the first race of the year. All these guys are raring to go. They're going into turn 1 in Bahrain, which is difficult. That turn 1, 2, 3 complex, not easy. Then you add the fact that it could potentially be dusty, etc., etc. Why wouldn't you just kind of keep your nose out of trouble at the back, put in the laps, and save the softer tires for later on in the race when you have lighter fuel loads? Instead, I think Seb got stuck with a bit of a crummy strategy, and he was just sort of lingering around at the back. That was until Ocon passed him. Now, I promised myself when I started this channel I was not going to show any favorites, and I've already made mention of the fact that Sebastian Vettel has not been somebody I've cheered for in the past. Having said that, I do like Seb. But I'm not sure what he was doing there. But to immediately blame Ocon for moving over was awful. I mean, it was just awful. Ocon never left his line after he exited the final corner. I mean, he drove straight down the left-hand side of the track. And Seb was told the entire lap beforehand by his engineer where Ocon was. 1.3, 0.8, he's got the DRS. Seb saw him in the mirror, moved over to protect the inside line, and then turned his vision towards the corner. And either didn't see Ocon pass him on the left, or didn't expect him to be there. But as he started to turn left to make his entry into turn 1, he just drove straight into the back of Esteban Ocon. The first thing I thought of when I saw that accident was, it reminded me of Schumacher during his comeback. Schumacher a couple of times got caught out a little bit under braking and found himself in the back of somebody's car. It looked the same to me. It reminded me of the same. So, that's a cool thought right there. For those of you who've been watching F1 for a while, let me know your comments. Let me know your thoughts. Did it remind you of similar? Has Sebastian lost a step, or is this car just not good and he had a really bad weekend? I mean, he shows up, doesn't know the car. He gets caught out in the Mazepin incident, ignores yellow flags, given a grid penalty, given a points penalty, and then runs into Ocon, gets a 10-second penalty, now finishing behind Russell, and also given more penalty points. I'm not sure how the weekend could have gotten worse for Sebastian Vettel, but as a fan of F1, I hope it gets better for him. Because whether or not you like him, watching Sebastian Vettel drive around at the back of the field struggling like this, making these types of mistakes, is not something I want to watch. I'm sure it's not something he wants to do, and it doesn't do his legacy any good. Qualifying in 17th position was Canadian Nicholas Latifi for Williams F1 Racing. Qualifying was an area that Nicholas Latifi had wanted to improve upon this year. At P17, I'm not too sure if that's an improvement. I mean, considering the Haas cars are nowhere, but solid session for Latifi, no mistakes. Same old from Nicholas, right? Nothing shocking, just steady improvement in little increments. I like the way he goes about his business. Is Nicholas Latifi ever going to turn the world upside down in F1? Probably not. But again, he was running steady in the race and unfortunately suffered I believe a boost pressure leak in the turbo unit and was forced to retire. Qualifying in 16th was Esteban Ocon. Certainly not where he wanted to be when considered his teammate Fernando Alonso put in a fantastic performance qualifying 9th. Esteban did get caught out a little bit with the yellow flags. I'm not too sure if the flags affected him in turn 1 with the Mazepin incident, but apparently there was another incident with Carlos Sainz that I did not see, and that might have affected his final hot lap as well. He was putting in a pretty steady performance, sort of in the mid-backfield. Had some interesting tussles there with Tsunoda. To be fair to Esteban, the Alpine wasn't really showing crazy pace. It was showing reliability, and it was stable. It didn't look that hard to drive. It just didn't look that fast. And it wasn't until later in the race where Ocon made the DRS pass down the main straight on Sebastian Vettel and was punted off the track. Despite potential damage to the rear of the car, Ocon did bring it home and finished in P13. Ocon remained very optimistic after the race and described how much he enjoyed racing wheel-to-wheel with Tsunoda. But if I were in Ocon's corner, I'd be tapping him on the shoulder saying you were being outperformed by Fernando Alonso by quite a margin. This team was achieving podiums towards the end of last year. You have to set your sights higher, son. So let's hope that Alpine pick up a little bit of pace, Ocon finds a bit of pace, and he finds himself more towards the middle of the pack. Qualifying in 15th position was George Russell from Williams F1. Unfortunately, the coverage didn't show too much of George, but I've since gone on the F1 TV app and watched a little bit of his in-car camera footage during the race. You know what? Russell drove a pretty solid race. As he mentioned, he thought he got the max out of the car during qualifying and actually was gifted a position due to Sebastian Vettel's penalty at the end of the race. And George Russell, I believe, finished 14th. I think this is pretty symbolic of the type of performance that we're going to get out of George this season. He's going to get the most out of that car. He's going to get the most out of every race. And I don't think he's going to score any points unless he gets very fortunate with retirements in front of him. But you know what? Kudos to George. Another great weekend. And onward and upward for him. Next, qualifying in 14th was the veteran and Iceman, Kimi Raikkonen. If you haven't heard the radio conversation between Kimi and his engineer, you have to go search it. It's just comedy gold. Thank God for Kimi. Kimi's already given us our first hilarity soundbite via F1 in-car radio for 2021. Kimi drove a great race. Steady, used a lot of experience, and just sort of managed the tires and got that car up to 11th place. Too bad he didn't get a point, because it was actually a really solid day for Kimi. In my 2021 predictions episode, I felt that Alfa Romeo would crease the gap between themselves and Williams, and after this week's race, I think it's fair to say that they have. Qualifying in 13th was AlphaTauri's driver, Yuki Tsunoda. AlphaTauri gambled, putting Tsunoda out on the medium tires in Q2, and he didn't get through. A bit of a tough break for the team, but I thought overall Yuki was one of the stars of the weekend. He was very accessible to the media, very engaging, and this kid can drive, folks. He certainly took advantage of having the high rake and driving into the headwind going into turn 1. I mean, his pass on Alonso was epic. He came from so far back and actually spoke about it after the race and said how much it meant to him to be passing somebody like Fernando Alonso, who was his father's idol. And Yuki himself had grown up idolizing Alonso. So really cool that he paid homage to Fernando, who was obviously in a slower car. But Tsunoda's performance over the weekend was phenomenal. And he ended up making a last lap pass on Lance Stroll, who was on completely dead tires, scoring his first points. So congratulations to Yuki, 9th place in his first Grand Prix. Well done, kid. Qualifying in P12 was Antonio Giovinazzi. Antonio is definitely on the hot seat in 2021, so it was a great omen for him to start the season off on the right foot by out-qualifying Kimi. Unfortunately, during the race, he went backwards, finishing just behind the Iceman in 12th position. Good news for Antonio, though, was he said he really enjoyed the car, really felt comfortable in it, so you know what? This duo is going to do pretty well this year. Qualifying in 11th place was Sergio Perez from Red Bull Racing. Calling this disappointing is just simply a huge understatement. The team had gambled that Sergio would be able to get through the qualifying session on the medium tire, and he didn't. I'm not too sure if he was involved in the yellow flag situation with Mazepin or Carlos Sainz, but the fact remains he was outside the top 10. Then, unfortunately, he suffered technical gremlins during the formation lap and was forced to start the race from the pit lane. As per usual, though, what did Sergio do on race day? He put in a phenomenal drive and got that car all the way back up to P5. Damage limitation, check. Great drive, check. He was even awarded the driver of the day for his efforts. So way to go, Sergio. Good comeback. And I look forward to Imola for sure, for Red Bull. Qualifying in P10 was Canadian Lance Stroll. I would categorize this weekend as incredibly disappointing for the Aston Martin team. Aston Martin looks to be one of the teams who are the most affected by not only the new regulations, but the low rake setting on their car. Like Seb, Lance did seem to have some trouble with the car's handling, and after qualifying made remarks that they certainly weren't on the pace of their closest rivals. Lance was hit twice early on in the race. I don't know if that caused any damage to the car, but the team did decide to go long on the first pit stop, which proved to be their undoing, as the undercut was obviously the better choice for the day. Going from bad to worse, when he did come in, the pit stop was 3.7 seconds long. So Stroll lost a number of positions. I believe he was running as high as 7th at one point, and when he came back out, he was in 11th. He continued to battle along with an ill-handling car until the very end, when he was finally passed on the final lap by Yuki Tsunoda. Despite everything that could go wrong, and did go wrong for Aston Martin this race, Lance Stroll has now scored the first points for Aston Martin's resurgence in Formula One. I, for one, expected quite a bit out of this team. I mean, I based all that on Seb's performance this year, but I'm honestly worried right now. I'm not too sure if that design of that car is going to work in 2021. And before you say, well, why don't they just lower the rake? Well, sounds easy. but they can't. The aerodynamics starting from the front wing, going all the way to the back wing, are flowing over the body panels. Those body panels are angled based on the rake. If you change the rake, now the airflow changes. The thing would only get worse. I do believe that they can manipulate ride height, but the rake is a design thing. This isn't just an adjustable component. Really, the rake is an integral component of the aerodynamic function of the car. And they're stuck until 2022. Qualifying in 9th place was the Matador, Fernando Alonso. Fernando was very impressive in qualifying. I think he got the most out of that Alpine. And in fact, they probably would have qualified a few places further back had Tsunoda and Perez not lost out on running on the medium tires. Alonso was running pretty solidly, enjoying some tussles at the back of the field before he retired on lap 37. He was comfortably outpacing Esteban Ocon all weekend, and I think it's a triumphant return for Fernando. Let's just hope that Alpine gets their act together. Looks like they have a pretty stable platform underneath them, but you know what, guys? Let's see some speed, man. Come on. Speaking of speed, how about Carlos Sainz? Way to go, Scuderia Ferrari. Carlos was on Charles Leclerc's pace all weekend, and wasn't it so cool when they both topped the timesheet in qualifying? You could almost hear the Tifosi's cry echo around the world of excitement. This team's for real, and you know what? They've made great improvements in the offseason, and I got to admit, I'm proud of them. I've had such a love-hate relationship with Ferrari throughout my time as a fan. As I said before, you need Ferrari to be competitive if you want Formula One to be successful. And having the two boys up there in the top 10 was fantastic, obviously aided by the soft tire in qualifying, but nevertheless, there was excitement amongst Ferrari. And you know what? Brighter days are ahead. Carlos ended up finishing in 8th place, exactly where he started, and brought home some important points in his first race as a Ferrari driver. Qualifying in 7th was Lando Norris, right behind his teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, who finished 6th. Great opening result for McLaren, but I must admit, I was a little underwhelmed. The car definitely looked solid, but it lacked a little bit of pace. And I'm not too sure yet where that pace is for them, other than, let's say, for example, Ricciardo getting a little bit more used to the car and being able to drive it a little bit harder. But as far as Lando goes, he's familiar with the car, and he's obviously proven to get the most out of the car on most occasions. Where was it? What is it? I can't put my finger on it yet. Still impressive debut for the team, and obviously Ricciardo, who was still struggling a little bit with the car in qualifying and in practice. Good result for them. Moving forward, I expect McLaren to really, really push the first two teams. Daniel ended up finishing the race in 7th place, while Norris just finished just outside the podium in 4th. I'm not surprised that Lando defeated Ricciardo in the inter-team battle this time around. I mean, these are early days, and Ricciardo admitted he did not get the most out of that car. But good on you, Lando. Good on you. He's trying to mark his spot on the team right now, and I think he did a fantastic job this weekend. So good job, McLaren. Good job, Lando. Good job, Honey Badger. Qualifying in 5th place for AlphaTauri was Pierre Gasly. Pierre is someone I have high expectations for this year, and he certainly didn't disappoint. He was fantastic in free practice, fantastic in qualifying. AlphaTauri were on top of the world with momentum going for them going into the race, and expectations and confidence were certainly high. I'd say at an all-time high. And this was my heartbreak of the race for me. In this sport, it's the littlest of margins that make people champions. And you've got to know what's going on around you. Ricciardo had been complaining all practice and qualifying about his brakes, and he admitted he was not quite on top of that car. So on lap 1, with Pierre in tow, you have Ricciardo going up the inside of a right-hand corner. You have to know on cold tires that Daniel is going to back out of that corner a touch. Pierre was following too closely. Ricciardo backs off. Bye-bye wing. Bye-bye race. I'm not too sure if Pierre could have battled up with the front two, but he certainly would have made the McLaren Valtteri Bottas battle a little interesting. A lot of points were lost. A lot of really valuable points were lost for AlphaTauri. Bad luck for Pierre, but boy, he was on it, wasn't he? He was really on it and fun to watch. Keep watching, but in race 1, not so good. Finishing in 4th place for Scuderia Ferrari. I'm always going to say it like that, I think. That might be one of the trademarks of the show, of how I say, Scuderia Ferrari. How about my boy Charles Leclerc? Whew. Yes, he was aided by the soft tire. We get it. But boy, Leclerc, when he needs to pull it out, he's got it. He's got that magic touch. And it makes perfect sense why Ferrari signed him to the longest contract that they've ever employed a Formula One driver for. Charles was very happy with the result after the race, finishing 6th. And together with Carlos Sainz, they're definitely looking forward to a good showing in Imola in 3 weeks. It's great to see that the Ferrari team have massively improved in the offseason, and I'm very excited to have them in the top 4 teams, mixing it out for the championship this year. Qualifying in 3rd place was Valtteri Bottas. I'm not too sure. Is this Bottas 2.0, 3.0, 5.0? But Valtteri certainly does look like he's in a different state of mind this year. A lot is being made right now about the fact that Valtteri did not kneel with Lewis in the pre-race moment to end racism. At the end of the day, well, at the end of qualifying, I should say, qualifying day, it was Lewis once again. Lewis once again who knew how to pull out those extra few tenths to come out on top of Valtteri. That was the first blow of the weekend. The 12-second pit stop was the gut punch that I think finally did it to him. Now, you can say what you want about Bottas, but if you take Lewis out of the equation and you take the 12-second pit stop out of the equation, Valtteri still loses to Max. The Red Bull was faster. Max was faster. The only problem come race day for both of them was Lewis was faster than both of them. Having said all this, Valtteri definitely did still get lucky this weekend. Not having Sergio or Pierre in the mix made the drive a little bit easier for sure. And then on top of that, he had a gap so he could pit for fresh tires and secure the fastest lap of the race. So nothing spectacular, but I definitely think Valtteri is lucky to get away with points for 3rd position and fastest lap. Qualifying in 2nd position was his teammate Lewis Hamilton. Or I should say, Sir Lewis Hamilton. There's a question for you. Why aren't people calling Lewis Hamilton Sir Lewis Hamilton? Is it just not a thing anymore? Or, I don't want to read into it too much, but I would think that being a Sir is kind of a cool thing. It's a pretty rare thing. I still forget to call him Sir Lewis Hamilton, but I'm going to work on it. Especially when you consider the Herculean effort that he pulled out this weekend to give Mercedes the first win of the season. There's no question that the Red Bull was faster. There's absolutely no question. And this should definitely help silence the fact that people are always saying Lewis only wins championships or wins races because he's in the fastest car. Well, I hate to break it to you. In Bahrain, Max was in the fastest car. Now, I will never claim to be a Formula One driver. I will never even claim to be a race car driver. All I will say to you is I have driven many types of race cars in many different types of categories. But these are my thoughts about what I observed while watching Lewis Hamilton's in-car camera. We all know that Mercedes were struggling with rear-end grip out of preseason testing, and it continued into the free practice sessions here in Bahrain. I think the easiest way for everybody to understand this, especially for those who are new to the sport, is to pause the podcast and go get yourself a pen or a pencil. Once you have that, I want you to put the pen or pencil down on a countertop, let's say, and then put 2 fingers around the pen and try and turn the top of the pen from 10 o'clock till 2 o'clock, back to 10 o'clock, forward to 2 o'clock, and keep doing it. Notice the distance that's traveled by the front of the pen compared to the back of the pen. If you're holding the middle of the pen, the distances essentially are the same. If you slide your fingers up the pen and do the same motion, you notice how much more the bottom of the pen is moving when compared to the top. This is when drivers are talking about balance. They're looking for what I call the turn-in point of the car. Now you're probably thinking, Matt, well, wouldn't we always want that turn-in point to be in the center? And my answer would be, not necessarily. But what we did notice was with the Mercedes in preseason testing, take your fingers up to the top of the pen and slide it back 10 to 2, back to 10, and forward to 2. You notice how much of the bottom part of the pen is moving. This is classic oversteer, and it was plaguing the Mercedes. I believe the decision was to intentionally incur understeer. This would move the balance point of the car more towards the center, and it would significantly reduce the amount the rear end would move around. The only problem is understeer. Understeer requires a completely different style of driving, and it certainly leaves you susceptible to being passed under braking. Your turn-in points are different, your corner exits are different, and this leads us to turn 4. Track limits had been imposed during both practice and qualifying for Turn 4, but it was deemed only to be monitored during the race. After Lewis got away pretty cleanly from the dirty side of the track, it must be said, and slotted in behind Max, it was now up to Mercedes to get him out in front of Max, because an understeery car handles much better when it's leading. This is where the undercut proved vital to the win for Mercedes, and essentially erased an 8-second lead by Max Verstappen. By race end, Lewis's tires were 10 laps older than Max's, and by the time Max had caught up to Lewis, he really didn't have that many opportunities left. I know many of you think, oh, he had a couple of laps. Not so. Max had used those tires up getting up to Lewis, and then when he had his little high-speed wiggle there, when he was in Lewis's dirty air, this would cause the temperatures of those tires to skyrocket, and it would take some time for them to come back down again. And let's face it, one of the reasons why they're making the changes to the rules of these cars is because they have trouble following each other. And we saw that even with the Red Bull. Max's day was undone by poor race strategy and by a 7-time world champion who knew exactly what to do to win this race. No other reason. It had nothing to do with Turn 4. Absolutely nothing to do with it. And those who are saying that it did, well then, maybe you just need to tune into what was said by the FIA before the race. I mean, even the drivers were asked individually afterwards what they thought their interpretation of the rule was, and they were all said, well, you know what, I can exceed track limits in Turn 4, I just can't do it to pass anybody. But then some of you say, well, obviously, if you do it over a 30-lap duration, this would give you an extended advantage throughout the duration of a race, sometimes adding up to, let's say, 2 or 3 seconds at the end of it. Christian Horner stated that he felt that it meant 0.2 per lap. Well, okay, I got you. But you know what? Have you ever understeered at 220 kilometers an hour? Do you know what that does to your tires? This was both a gain and sacrifice by Lewis and Mercedes. That was one of those corners where Lewis had to maintain that speed, his entry speed into that corner, which was, like I said, definitely going to be affected by the understeer conditions. But the only way Lewis could carry any speed throughout that corner was to go wide. And up until half race distance, he was told that he was allowed to do that. And when he got the radio call that he was no longer allowed to exceed track limits, he no longer did. Now, if you think he's the only person in the field who was exceeding track limits in Turn 4, I invite you to go back and watch the race again. Preferably on the F1 TV app, which I have. This is something I recently purchased for myself to help me with the podcast, and the coverage is fantastic. The ability to be able to go into anybody's in-car camera and watch an incident, that's what I did with Vettel's incident. Lewis won this race. The undercut worked. And he made his last set of tires last a long time. He harvested his battery for the end of the race to defend against Max. He knew Max would only have 2 or 3 laps to really mount a charge. This is how you win championships, folks. And I have to admit, Red Bull looked a little bit stunned at the end of it. But they didn't protest. But yet Christian Horner and Toto Wolff reached out to the FIA for clarification. Now, this may not be in line with current safety standards, but I will say this. You want to know what definitely defines track limits? Walls. As long as the sport continues to move in the direction of safety with larger runoff areas, etc., walls aren't an option. And therefore teams will look to take advantage of the rules, especially if the rules are not set in stone. If they're just going to wash down a gray river, well, then we're all going to be questioning it, and there's going to be debate afterwards. And speaking of debate, I'm looking forward to your thoughts and comments. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you're looking to connect with me on social media, please do. Dirty_F1 on Twitter and the TheDirtyAirF1Podcast on Instagram. My name is Matthew Kane. I've been your host. Boy, I hope you enjoyed the first race as much as I did. And I can't wait till 3 weeks from now when all these guys line up in Imola. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.